welcome to this video on gathering data on the emotional factor. Today we're going to talk about the emotional factor, and in particular we're going to focus on the PPW and the SCAT test as two methods that we can use to collect information on emotional subfactors. At Higher PE, on screen just now are some common questions that you may get asked about collecting information on the emotional factor. You may be asked to identify an analytical tool used to collect information or data on the emotional factor. You might be asked to identify a recognised test used to collect information or data on the emotional factor. You might be asked to describe an analytical tool used to collect information or data on the emotional factor, or to describe a recognised test used to collect information on the emotional factor. Similarly, the questions might be worded just describe a method used to collect information on emotional factors, and we're also going to cover explaining why we selected this method, why it was appropriate, and we're going to analyse how suitable this method was within this video. So there are some examples of common question types that you might see in your Higher PE exam. So we're going to cover two methods during this video, the SCAT test and the PPW. We're going to start off by looking at the SCAT test. On screen just now you can see the SCAT test. It's a double-sided sheet of A4 paper, and on the left-hand side you can see the first side of the sheet of paper, and on the right-hand side you can see the second side of the sheet of paper. It's important to note here that the SCAT test is a recognised test, and it's used to find out our anxiety level. So, the Sports Competition Anxiety Questionnaire, or SCAT test. This is a double-sided sheet of A4 paper with 15 statements on it. These are in a table, and inside the table there is 3 headings: rarely, sometimes, or often. This test would be completed after a competitive performance on your own. How we complete it is we read the statements and then we tick rarely, sometimes, or often. Some of these answers will score you 1, 2, or 3 points on the table on the back. You then compare your scores to the key, and this gives us a chance to then compare our score to the table of norms. If your score is less than 17, you've got a low level of anxiety. If your score is between 17 and 24, you've got an average level of anxiety, and if your score is more than 24, you've got what's known as a high level of anxiety. We're now going to look at how we would describe this method in a full answer. On screen just now is a description of the SCAT test. Pause the video here to read the answer in more detail. The second method that we're going to look at is the performance profile wheel, and this method can be used to gather data on any factor. It's an analytical tool, and it's a double-sided sheet of A4. How this would differ, depending on the factor, is you would write different subfactors around the outside. On screen just now you can see the first side of the sheet of paper, where on the left-hand side you would rate yourself from 1 to 10 on each of the subfactors, and you would then rate yourself compared to a model performer. You would rate what does their anxiety level look like in a sport of your choice, what does their anger level look like in a sport of their choice, what does their fear level look like in a sport of their choice, what does their happiness level look like in a sport of their choice. And you would generally expect a performer who's a model performer to be scoring quite highly here. So, the PPW, well, it's a double-sided sheet of A4 paper with 2 wheels on each side, as you've just seen. Each wheel has 8 segments, and you write the subfactors around the outside. Inside each of these segments, it's split 1 to 10, and you rate yourself from 1 to 10. 1 is an area of weakness, and 10 is an area of strength. You shade up from the middle of the wheel, and then you select what you think your score would be. If you think that you are a 7 out of 10 for controlling your anxiety, you would shade up 7 boxes. You complete the first wheel based upon your own performance in a sport, and then you complete the second wheel where you compare yourself to a model performer from that sport. Once you've done this, hand your PPW to your coach, and he will then complete the wheels on the other side of the sheet of paper. He will rate your performance, and then he will also rate the model performer, and we can compare our results. On screen just now is a descriptive example of a PPW. Again, pause the video here so you can look at this in more detail. You may also be asked in your Higher PE exam to explain reasons why you selected this method, and to answer this question you need to use the PAR-VM structure. If you'd like more information about this, have a look at the suitability of a method video on my channel for more detail on how to answer this question. We're now going to have a little look at an analysis question, which is the AB style questions, which are looking to separate the AB candidates at Higher PE. To answer this question, we need to consider the benefits of using a SCAT test or a PPW, and we also need to consider the limitations of using a SCAT test or a PPW. So, what are the benefits of using a SCAT test? Well, this is a test which is completed by yourself, and you know yourself and your emotions better than anyone else, so you're the best person to rate yourself here. The SCAT test also gives you a score, and we can compare that score to the table of norms at the bottom of the SCAT test, and we can also keep this result and we can compare back to it in future. So there's some benefits for using the SCAT test. Here are some benefits for using our PPW. Well, again, this is completed by yourself, and you are the best person to rate your emotional skills out of 10. The results are easy to interpret, and you can still select the sub-factors which go around the outside. PPW is also very useful because it can be filled out in different locations. It can be completed after a competitive performance, it can be completed at home, and it can be completed before training. And we can also get our coach to check our answers to ensure that we're not being too harsh or we're being biased. We're now going to consider the limitations of these tests and what potential problems might occur that would affect the results of our tests. Well, because this test, the SCAT test, is completed by yourself, you might be dishonest and you might be too harsh on yourself. You may also not understand some of the words or some of the statements in the SCAT test, and that can lead with issues in how you answer the questions. And lastly, it's important that you complete this on your own and you don't have other people around you who might influence your results. Moving on now to the limitations of the PPW. Again, because this is completed by you, you may be too harsh on yourself. Similar to the SCAT test, you may not complete this in a quiet space on your own and you might be influenced by other people around you. It's important that you get this checked by a coach to make sure your results are accurate. If you don't do that, then you might be biased or dishonest. And lastly, when comparing yourself to a model performer, it's important that you pick a realistic model performer rather than someone perhaps who is your age or your friend as a model performer. Here's what a question might look like in your higher PE exam, and we're now going to look at a benefit and a limitation, both of which would get a mark. The question is asking you to analyse, so we're going to try and break it down into its important parts, how suitable the method is in collecting data on the emotional factor. Here's an example answer written in the 3-step process, the 3 I's to answer an analyse question. The first thing we're going to do is identify something. We're then going to give the implication, so what that means, and we're going to expand upon what we've picked out. And then we're going to give the impact. What's the result that's going to have on the data that we have gathered? So this person has said it's important to complete the PPW honestly. So that's our identification. The middle part, this means that performer can rate their emotional skills out of 10 and honestly reflect upon their performance. What's the impact this is going to have? Well, this leads to the data gathered being valid because they are able to accurately reflect on whether or not the sub-factor is a strength or a weakness. We're now going to look at a limitation of the SCAT test. It's important that the performer answers the SCAT test questions correctly and honestly. This means that if the performer rates themselves as sometimes, when they should have ticked always, this will affect the score they get for this test. This leads to their score maybe being lower than it should have been, suggesting that their anxiety was a strength, when actually it's a weakness. Thank you for watching this short video on the emotional factor.